everyone. I am Clare Loughrige, and I'm the president of the International Enneagram Association Great Lakes chapter. So that sounds really important, doesn't it? It is, it is our tribe that's gathering here. Many of us who are on the board, if you just wave and let folks know that you're serving on the board so that they know who our folks are, that'd be great. Lynn, wave. Sean, wave. So what I'm really excited about today is that this is a prelude to a workshop. And Jerry Wagner and Oliver Nicklin just hit it out of the park every spring, every fall, by bringing us the best and brightest, most grounded individuals to help us learn the Enneagram. And so this coming workshop on April 7th and 8th at Loyola University it's beyond belief. We have Russ Hudson, who is one of the greats among us and a co-founder of the Enneagram Institute and has been teaching the Enneagram since 1991, co-author of many works. Many of you get the Ennea Thought. If you get the Ennea Thought, wave at us. Let us know that's part of your story. And Russ Hudson teaming up with Tom Condon, who's worked with the Enneagram since 1980. With Erickson Hypnosis and NLP since 1977. And he combines these models for workshops that create great change. And the title of this upcoming workshop that's on April 7th and 8th at Loyola is Horizontal and Vertical Change. And so before we get into the nuts and bolts of what that means, I just want to welcome Tom. Everybody say, hey, Tom, thanks for coming. And we want you to just tell us about how you and Russ came to work together.
Well, we've been friends for a long time. It's been a friendship conducted mostly for a long time in foreign capitals because we kept running into each other overseas, and then we would meet up at conferences and things like that, and stayed in touch and had sort of the beginnings of a dialogue for a long time. That then in the last few years, I'd say the last 5 years, has gotten more detailed and complex. We have pretty different backgrounds. My background, as you said, is in NLP, which is all about method and about, it's kind of behaviorism, really. And there is, I might add just right off the bat, there's two kinds of NLP. One is sleazy and grandiose, and another one is very deep and thoughtful and helpful. And my background was mainly emphasizing methods of change, and NLP does two things really well. It provides you with an understanding of different methods of change, even though they exist in different therapies or different spiritual practices. It finds out what's in common with all of them and helps you extract that and then just sort of use the bare bones of the method without the trimmings that way. And it helps you understand different methods of change in a new way. And then the other thing it does, which dovetailed, as it turned out, with my discussions with Russ, is emphasize sensory experience, direct sensory experience. In other words, when somebody is having a problem, what do they see? What do they hear? What do they feel? What do they taste? What do they smell? And kind of taking it out of the realm of the abstract or the global and bringing it down to sort of minute particulars. And in doing that, then an NLP practitioner, a good one, can work with those things and work with sensory qualities and help somebody kind of open up in a way, or get in touch with the fact that they are the creator of their problem, let's say. And this seems to be very useful in working with the Enneagram, because people talk in kind of global abstract terms sometimes with it, and they'll get into models of models of models, and bringing it down to earth. I like your word grounded a little while ago. grounding it in direct sensory experience is something that Russ and I both, through our different backgrounds, really emphasize, and we'll be emphasizing this workshop.
Yeah, well, we're excited about that, even when we consider horizontal and vertical change. In my tradition, that would give me this idea of the cross, and adding attachment theory to that, which is how we relate is how we relate. That how we relate in a vertical way is how we relate horizontally. And so how we relate horizontally is how we relate vertically. They cannot be extracted. They are inextricably bound. So I'm wondering, what is horizontal change? What is vertical change in your model?
We sort of thought we had thought of these distinctions, but of course they exist in a number of people's models. But what we mean by it is horizontal change has to do with personal biography, resolving things in your personal history that you're still carrying around and reproducing via your Enneagram style. When people react out of the low side of their Enneagram style, our contention would be that they're basically in a defensive mode. And there are characteristic defenses that go with each Enneagram style. But you're defended in a certain way and inside of a kind of personal trance. And in that trance, there's a motivation for your behavior and a defensive logic to it. But it usually has more to do with the past than the present. It has more to do with a way in which you made adaptations earlier in life that protected you and maybe saved you. And now they're the thing that gets in the way. You know, the thing that used to work is the thing that now is troubles you, because the original circumstances where the defense got going have changed. You know, this is the world of 2018. There was no Google back then when you developed those defenses. And so working on those in a horizontal way means things like connecting the dots between your present reactions and maybe aspects of your personal history. It also means getting in touch with the defensive purpose behind the low side of someone's Enneagram style. In other words, when you're reacting out of having reactivity or behaving compulsively or behaving in a kind of automatic way, it has some sense to it. There's some unconscious logic. There's a way in which it feels like the right thing to do or the only thing to do. And so getting at that sometimes means beginning to identify, well, how is this helping me? And what is this doing for me? And how is my Enneagram part, so to speak, protecting me? And, you know, that sort of thing. And once you explore that, sometimes it means going near your shadows, going near the third rail of your experience, so to speak. But at the same time, you don't really have to, abreact or relive a trauma or something like that. Usually just touching into something is quite helpful, kind of like salad dressing. If you had a bottle of salad dressing and you didn't know what the ingredients were, then you taste it, run it around your tongue and identify the ingredients, call them by their right name, decide what you liked and disliked about it. And that often is enough, rather than somebody plunging back into some, horrible trauma or something like that. So horizontal change has to do with biography, and essentially it has to do with psychology. And then vertical change is deeper than that, as the term suggests, and has to do with going underneath not only your personal psychological defenses, but also kind of exploring the ground of your being, getting at what Russ would call presence. And some people use the word essence. I have a little trouble with that word because it's so vague, but everybody has a different individual specific experience of that. And what you're trying to do at that point is sort of go beyond the limits of your worldview, especially the worldview that you're kind of surrounding your head with and your body with when you're in your Enneagram trance. And in doing that, it's sort of like your ego still has its uses. You're not going to get rid of it. If you plot to get rid of it, it hears you plotting. So naturally, it sabotages you. But to have your ego sort of fall into place and become like a scout or something that guides you at various times when it's useful, but is sort of like your left arm, just one aspect of your being. Mm-hmm. So the vertical and the horizontal together, what we're trying to do is sort of integrate the psychological and the spiritual rather than having them be separate. Yeah. If you just work on yourself psychologically, it's possible to go on and on and on. Sort of like Woody Allen, going to a psychotherapist for 40 years. And if you just work on the spiritual and ignore the psychological, that often leads to what they call now spiritual bypass.
Yeah.
Where, I'm being spiritual and I sort of spiritualize my ego, let's say. And in doing that, I ignore the influence of biography and the kind of unconscious will to make things familiar, even if they're dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so we could also say that's a false bifurcation, that you could actually separate your spirituality from your psychology.
Right.
And then even considering the groundedness. So I wonder, Tom, if you were talking to a particular type, let's just pick one. We could even start with 8, start with a body type. Someone coming to you and saying, when I'm in my Enneagram trance, I am powering up, I'm dominating, I'm pushing my way, and it typically shows up at noon at work. And how would you respond to that in helping them get in touch with the horizontal and vertical?
Well, one thing I would do is fish around for motivation. And motivation is, motivation to change is, there are common elements to all Enneagram styles, like I'm suffering, I'm causing suffering, I'm getting reactions that I don't want to have. And then in particular, if I'm working with an 8, they might definitely be getting reactions they don't want to have or that they're baffled by because they're aggressive in a sort of out of touch way. And I might kind of begin to zero in on the polarity involved in being strong versus being weak, and try to evoke those and maybe get them together over time and get them a little more connected. 8s usually, when they're in their trance, believe that they are protecting themselves by bullying themselves, and they don't quite realize that they are their own worst enemy that way. They believe that if they bully themselves and suppress vulnerable feelings, and then that same pattern and tactic is expressed in their relationships, then they'll be safe, and they'll be safe in the terms of their history. But actually, it's kind of paradoxical. The extreme of 8, if somebody's really profoundly unhealthy within it, is that they're trying to murder their vulnerabilities in order to keep them safe. Mm-hmm. So, and all these styles, all Enneagram styles have paradoxes like that. 6s scare themselves in order to feel safe, that kind of thing. It makes no sense except to a 6. Mm-hmm. So that would be one thing. I'd kind of try to key in on the vulnerability, and a kind of, usually there's a younger self somewhere who is being protected, and then there's a rough and tough customer who is doing the protecting, and then getting that logic, kind of the emotional logic of that kind of untangled really helps. Another thing is, when 8s are in their trance, they stop seeing people 3-dimensionally and start to see them as caricatures, sort of like cartoons, like political cartoons. And in doing that, then they're being aggressive towards and possibly mean towards a caricature rather than a full human being. And so that makes it easy for them to do that. They also see themselves as caricatures and will use metaphors. They'll say, like, I'm a broken down tank, or I'm a junkyard dog. That one's popular in America. And that gives me an indicator through a style of listening that comes with NLP, gives me an indicator of the self-image that the person's harboring when they're in their Enneagram trance. And so getting them to go from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, sometimes I'll have them pick somebody that they love and have them turn that person into a caricature and then turn them back into a 3D, full person. And in doing that, sometimes they'll be quite startled and surprised to realize that, that's what they're doing to themselves. That's what they're doing to other people. That helps. Sometimes 8s are motivated by, 8s tend to externalize. They tend to, in addition to denial, which we would talk about in Enneagram books as a typical defense for the style, I didn't do it, and besides, she deserved it, where you kind of minimize and you kind of, you don't hear how loud your voice is or how harsh your comments are, things like that. In addition to that, 8s will externalize their inner conflicts. So they might be in a group of people and they'll see somebody who is obviously powerful, or maybe the authority in the circumstance, or the teacher in a workshop. And then they'll see somebody who represents their vulnerability. This is a little like psychodrama, where you kind of externalize your inner dynamic so that you can witness it. And helping 8s to sort of see that and to recognize that also is useful. And then there's the individual goal that the 8 might have, how to talk more civilly to people or something like that, and how to tame their aggression, and getting them in touch with what happens right before they get aggressive, let's say. What's happening right before you blow up, before you, insult someone.
Well, we have a little question here, Tom, asking people if they have a question for you, and I'm not seeing anything yet, so I want to take you to heart types. So rather than doing individual types, how are you working with heart types when you're considering horizontal and vertical change?
Well, we're not really doing it according to type, or according to groups of types necessarily. Even though we talk about types, people are individuals. And so it has a lot to do with what somebody is ready for, what they're motivated for. 8s are motivated differently to change than 3s. You might find a 3 who has been a workaholic all their life, or has...
Actually, I wasn't asking about 3s, Tom. Let's skip right and go to 2s and 4s.
Yeah, so let me tell you.
Everybody put up your gang sign. What's your type?
Yeah, well,
yeah.
To all of you, it had to be something. So, but with a 3 might be motivated differently. They might suddenly realize they might have a health crisis from overwork. They might suddenly realize that their children are 2 inches taller than the last time they noticed, and that they're neglecting that part of their life. Or that there was one man who was a 3 who was on television, who was a reporter, and he said the turning point for him, he was very career driven. The turning point for him was he heard that one evening his wife and his daughter were watching TV, and he came on the TV and he was reporting on a fire or something. And the little girl looked up from what she was doing and said, "Look, Mama, there's the man who took us to the zoo." He said that shook him to his toenails, just getting that sense of what you're missing sometimes, and realizing that there's more to life than being a spook of stop and go, a kind of robotic person who checks things off a list and stays focused on task. And threes will sometimes move towards an appreciation of other people instead of being locked into a mode of activity and information, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So the motivation's different. And then there's different styles of working that I have. These won't be covered quite in the same way in this workshop, but we are going to structure it so that everybody who comes can bring with them something that they'd like to change about, let's say, the low side expression of their Enneagram style. And in doing that, then we'll have various exercises, interactive activities, and our own perspectives and the feedback that we can give, because as you can imagine, we are famous, internationally recognized experts on egotism.
Claire, Lynn had a question specifically about fours, if she wants to unmute, and if you want to ask Tom what you'd like to know specifically about fours.
What about them?
Go ahead, Lynn.
Did I unmute?
You're unmuted.
You're unmuted.
I thought you had asked about them, and the question just was, did I miss what you had said about fours? Because I heard you talking about the twos and fours and the heart type, but then I didn't. Then I heard we go into threes, and I wondered if I missed what you said about fours.
No, not really. We're just giving examples. This is kind of a limited format to go into each style, so you didn't miss anything.
Yeah, I was trying to get Tom off the subject of threes and on to twos and fours. So yeah. And so Lynn, do you have something specifically you'd like to ask about the horizontal and vertical change with fours?
Well, I was just interested in what he, something specific about what he saw as they were trying to integrate. But if that's too specific, and he's already, gotten into those.
Well, a lot of times learning how to disassociate and to stand back from your feelings and your moods and to witness them, sort of like Helen Palmer's in her method. She would have people develop an inner observer. That sort of thing is useful. Also, learning how you're identified with your pain and how it's a kind of identity. It's like being a permanent expatriate, longing for your home country but never going back and visiting, that sort of thing. There's actually a lot to it, so I'm not sure how much detail to go into. I would say broadly, in terms of the centers, that twos, threes, and fours, the lifelong assignment, if you like, that the Enneagram seems to imply is becoming more real, kind of separating sort of pseudo feelings from your direct and true feelings, and kind of getting over confusing seeming with being. Where you get caught up in roles, and in the case of a four, you're playing a role of somebody who is unique and special. But when you really get in touch, you are unique and special, but in a different way. And with threes, they'll be emphasizing success and activity and accomplishment, and then there's a shadow that goes with that, which is an insecure younger person, or a vulnerable place in them that they fear is who they really are, and they're trying to outrun that shadow. And with twos, they'll repress their own selfishness and play the role of somebody who is entirely helpful, but actually they're giving to other people by metaphor. And with eights, nines, and ones, the tendency, the general overall assignment is to become more aware of your own needs and the fact of yourself, because all three styles tend to delete the self. They tend to kind of, twos, threes, and fours kind of reject themselves. Eights, nines, and ones kind of just drop themselves out of their own pictures. And you see it most obviously with nines who, blend with the woodwork. But 8s will also talk about feeling invisible, for example. And 1s will shift off of their own personal needs and emphasize and focus on what's wrong or missing or out of place or what needs to be done and what kind of moral mountains to climb, that kind of thing. And with 5, 6, and 7s, it has more to do with integrating power. All 3 styles project power. 6s most obviously, but 7s and 5s do it as well. And in the projection of power, then they overuse their strength, they overuse their heads, they overuse their minds, and that's why we call them mental types. They go through life leading with their heads. And in doing that, they have a tendency to feel like there's power out there that can influence them, and that they don't have true free will. They don't have true freedom of choice. You know, they can't say yes and say no without some sort of conflict, because their power is projected onto some outside force. With 5s, it's like the social aura of the world around them and how that might impinge on them, or what relationships might require of them. With 6s, it's, you project onto an authority, the government, the IRS, your boss, a parent, somebody in your life who seems to have strong opinions. And with 7, you project your own freedom of choice, even though you don't realize it, and you think that you're full of choices, but you're hyperactively making choices in order to get away from the shadow of a sense of being locked in a psychological closet, or being trapped in some other way, limited in some other way. And then your response is to begin immediately fantasizing about your next vacation in Morocco or something like that. So the challenge becomes integrating power with those styles. The challenge with 8, 9, and 1 is sort of recovering a self that you defensively delete. And with 2s, 3s, and 4s, it has more to do with accepting a part of you that you reject and resolving any kind of shame or embarrassment that goes with that.
Tom, I'm wondering, since I don't see any questions in the sidebar, I'm wondering if you could lead us in a practice that would help us with this process of horizontal and vertical. If there's a short practice that we could do together.
Well, I want to say save something for the workshop.
Yeah.
And in doing that, let me talk a little more about there's motivation to change. There's creating goals. What would you be like if you were freer within your Enneagram style? Generally speaking, people talk about wearing it more lightly, or the experience of that is, you have a template, you have a filter through which you react to events, but you have a lot more emotional choice. And you have choice in a biographical sense, in a horizontal sense. You don't have to play those roles you used to play when you were in high school or in your family of origin. And then also there's, on a vertical level, there's a sense of expansiveness. There's a sense of presence. There's a sense of opening up to what's beyond your personal self, in a way. And so people define that differently. And of course, you define it according to a moment in your life. If you come to the workshop, then there'll likely be something that's up for you in relation to your Enneagram style. And you can bring that, and that can work on that. Yes, Teresa?
Excuse me, Tom. Can you go back to the very beginning when you were talking? I think someone else had the question as well. And it's newer terminology to me in the NLP and just what that is and what that exercise. Some of us weren't sure what that even stood for. Can you kind of broaden that out for us?
Yeah. It stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming, which is a scientific sounding name the creators made up so they could copyright it and it would sound scientific. It is behavioristic, it is in the sense that it's focused on changing behavior. People involved with NLP in a pure sense, or in the early days, would not like the Enneagram at all, because the Enneagram is what they call content. They would say it with a little bit of disdain too. And however, what I find is that something like NLP, and it gives you a bunch of tools for working with behavior and altering behavior, altering internal sequences that people go through, or altering the sensory qualities that are present in a problem or in a typical reaction. So, for example, with a 6, which is me, and that's why I'm pointing to both my heads, there is a tendency, if you're scaring yourself, there are certain things that you do internally in order to accomplish that. And like I was saying before, 6s will scare themselves as a kind of defense in order to be prepared so that they'll ultimately be safe. But the being safe part gets dropped out, and you get preoccupied with what's fearful. And so in the fearful elements of that, what do? I mean, you have images in your mind's eye. Are they small? Are they tiny little snapshots? No, they're large. They have to be big in order to be scary, and they have to be bigger than you. They have to be overwhelming. Maybe they're up above you and kind of looming over you. And I don't know what the image is. You know, it's like, okay, I think of my boss and I see him as larger than me, and maybe I see it as a movie rather than as a still picture. Maybe it's bright and colorful. You know, if it's in soothing pastels, it wouldn't be as frightening. Am I talking to myself in a calm, quiet, steady, new age kind of voice? No, probably not. I'm probably yelling at myself. I'm probably talking in a really loud voice. It'd be like being in one of these multiplex theaters now and sitting down in the front row, where you get blasted by the sound and overwhelmed by the picture. And sometimes getting a 6 in touch with something like that and aware of something like that, you can begin to mess with the elements. And this is one thing that's really nice about NLP, and kind of opens up the Enneagram too. Number one, the person begins to realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm doing this. I'm doing this to myself. I'm doing this to myself, and it has some logic to it. Maybe you explore that further. But when I'm doing this to myself, what happens if I take the image and shrink it? The image of my boss, you know, I make him smaller than me, you know. What if I bring the image down in front of me? What if I drain the color out of the image and turn it pastel? What if I quiet the voice down, or make it sing, or make it talk from a different location? I've done this with 1s too, where the person will have a critical voice and it sits on their shoulder and kind of yammers at them all day long about what they're doing wrong. And I encourage them sometimes to take the voice and put it down in their shoe. And they'll do the exercise, put it down in their shoe, and they'll hear it coming out of their shoe. On some shoes, the sole of the shoe looks a little like a speaker. And the voice comes out of their shoe, and they can listen to it the 20% of the time that they want to, because most 1s don't want to amputate their critical voice. It keeps them honest. It keeps them going. It keeps them trying to excel. They don't want it gone. They just want it to shut up some of the time. And so you put it in their shoe, and then they listen for a little while. And when they've had enough, they put their foot down. That kind of thing. You're messing with the sensory structure of experience. Sometimes the sensory sequence, like I was saying about 8s, you know, what happens right before you have an explosion? You know, what happens right before you say something aggressive towards somebody? What leads up to that? And usually there's a reliable sensory sequence. So NLP clues you into these things in what I find is a really useful way. It's a can opener for the Enneagram.
Thank you. That was great description of, that was awesome. Thank you.
One more thing. If you're a 4, what happens when you envy? You know, usually what happens before you are envious is that you've rejected something about yourself. That's the first step. Then you might be just conscious of the envy. But if you're going to envy something, think about it. You know, it has to be out of reach. And when you ask 4s about some alternative or some person that they envy, that person or the image of that person or the sense of that person will be farther than they can reach with their arms. Does that make sense? So it's a kind of calculus in a way, but it's not just intellectual. It's kind of taking apart what is somebody's problematic experience and working with the elements of it, working with what's underneath it, maybe in a horizontal way, working with how it got going and what they think they're doing now, you know, by protecting themselves in this manner. And all of that stuff I find really useful. When I first got involved with the Enneagram, there were very few methods. It was 1980, and I lived in Berkeley, California. Helen was teaching, and Claudio Naranjo was around sometimes, and there were other people that I knew who were involved in it. And I did take a kind of panel workshop one time with Helen, but mostly I had notes and handouts that people would bring me from classes, and I got a pretty good stack of them. And I sort of sat there for a long time. I had a private practice in NLP, and I sort of tried to integrate the Enneagram and NLP, you know, in whatever way I could. And then the books came out, and the thing kind of opened up. But in the early days, the methods, I just thought, you know, you could throw anything at the Enneagram and it would be helpful, because there were 2 methods. One was captured in that Bob Newhart video on YouTube where he plays a psychiatrist, and a woman comes in and says, I've got this terrible fear of being locked in a box, and I've got all these phobias and all these limitations. And Bob Newhart's psychiatrist says, well, I have some advice for you. Are you ready? And the woman says, yes, anything. Bob Newhart says, stop it. And that was pretty much the idea in those days was, you know, you're a 1, you're judgmental, stop it. You know, you're a 6, you're scared, quit being scared. And there is some value in going against the neurotic or defensive tendencies of your Enneagram style. But if that's all you do, you're going to find change really slow. It's going to take a long time. And so there was stop it, and then the other one was, well, here's all these kind of terrible things about you, because all of the descriptions in those days were negative. They were, you know, it was all about pathology. And so here's all these pathological tendencies you have. You really should meditate about those. That was the other recommendation, was meditate. Because the limitations of people's Enneagram styles were just presented pretty much as a fait accompli. So I thought, you know, anything, apply a bunch of methods to it was the thing to do.
Some great takeaways. Jennifer, you have a question that you'd posted. Do you want to unmute and ask Tom?
I'm not sure I have the words to ask the question, but I'll try. I'm newer to the Enneagram, and as I am learning about each different type, my goal is to really become an expert, you know, in knowing each type, but I get so overwhelmed by all the characteristics. I'm wondering if you experience people who have a recommendation for how I should go about trying to learn about each one at a time, or in groupings, or just give it time.
It's how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer is practice. And as you learn it, you'll plateau from time to time. There'll be points where you think, oh, now I've really got my hands on something. Now I've really got this thing under my belt. And you then, the following week, will meet somebody who contradicts some generalization that you've already formed. And the thing to do with it, I think, is to cultivate beginner's mind, to keep learning, keep applying it, treat it like a hobby rather than some central thing that you must master, because it doesn't really lie flat on paper. It's something that you add to through your experience, you add to through your self-observation and work with others. And in doing that, maybe think of holding a bird in your hand, where you don't want to hold it too tight or you'll kill the bird, and you don't want to hold it too loosely or the bird will fly away. And you'll meet people who hold it too tight, especially, who really try to overrate the influence of type on somebody's behavior. It comes out in groups sometimes. People will say, "Oh, look, she's pouring him a cup of coffee. She's our resident 2." And there's a kind of affection in it, but also a kind of typecasting in it. And I think when you're doing that, it's a little like educated bigotry. You can sort of fall into a way of seeing where the person's Enneagram style is the main thing you're seeing, and when you do that, it's not different from racial or gender bigotry or something like that. Mm-hmm. You're mistaking the part for the whole. And then also traits, mistaking outer behavior for inner Enneagram styles. You have to, in staying open and kind of keeping a beginner's mind, you have to sort of take things that people do as clues, rather than, oh, well, he's eating fast. That means he's a 7. It's a clue, but he may have also come from a large family where there wasn't much food and there was competition and people ate fast. Or I've known a number of 2s who tailgate in traffic. And it makes a kind of sense when you think about it. Somebody who wants to be close to people drives too close to them in traffic. But at the same time, if I'm looking in my mirror driving down the street and I see a car behind me that's too close, and I think, oh, damn, those 2s, I'm being a bigot. And so it's sort of a funny balance. There's no real absolute certainty that you can grab onto, except for being open and reminding yourself of the difference between a clue and something more definitive.
Nice.
And there are times when something's really obvious to you, and you can kind of memorize what the feeling is that goes with that.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, Morley has a comment or a question for you. Okay. Hello, Morley. You're mute. You have to unmute.
Sorry. Hello, Claire. I'm unmuted now.
Yes.
And this is a comment. I've been learning about the Enneagram for about 5 years now. Mm-hmm. And I first heard I heard David Daniels speak on the Shift Network about 3 or 4 years ago, and Helen Farmer at that time. And I decided to take the path of the narrative tradition because it helps a lot to hear a story or stories on panels. And I recently got certified as a professional using the Enneagram and the narrative tradition, and I'm looking to, use my skills. At the same time, I have also taken a break in my time. I just retired from a university job, and I'm trying to actually try to put this question in context for the woman who just asked about, how can we identify types? Is that early in my learning process, I was having lunch with a group of the students who were in the Enneagram class with me, and I started to label them because we had kind of talked about types. And this gentleman really pushed hard when I said, that sounds like you're, in this case, a type 1. And that experience has stuck with me, and I try not to label. Yeah. I'm very careful about labeling people as I talk with them. And as you were saying, the cues or triggers may all add up differently when you have the full picture. So you want to start with a cue, and sometimes that cue may apply to 2 or 3 different types, as we find out in typing interviews. And so it's enough to have the cue, but just note the cue, but try to create a set of dots that you connect in a conversation over a half an hour to an hour before you jump to any conclusions about a type and jump to any labels. Because a label can work against your relationship in that situation.
Speed typing is a lot like snap judgment.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Morley.
Exactly.
And
Tom, I teach them. Yeah.
So we have just about 2 to 3 minutes. I wonder if there's any closing comments that you have, Tom, or...
Morley reminded me of my first experience at the first Enneagram conference in Stanford in 1994. I was standing in line, and somebody came up to me and said, "What's your Enneagram type?" Not "What's your name?" I wasn't especially known within the thing. "What's your Enneagram type?" And I thought about it for a moment and decided to answer. I said, "Well, I'd be a counterphobic 6." And the reply was, "You can't be a 6. You have 7 hair."
Thank you.
You do have 7 hair and a 7 beard.
Yeah. Thank God.
I'm kidding. So what would you say to us as we're getting ready for April 7th and 8th? How would we give an invitation to friends? How can we do this on the newsletter that we would say, you don't want to miss this? Something about that.
Bring something about your Enneagram style and your reactions that you'd like to change. Well, a good time will be had by all. Tom and Russ come from very different backgrounds, but they meet in the middle, and they have a bridge and a real rich set of, experiences and methods to apply to changes that you might like to make. This will not be about learning more detail about each Enneagram type, as they say, and then drowning in information. This will be about what to do with it, rather the question that comes up in people's minds after they've studied with it for a while, which is, now that I know these things about myself, what do I do about it? And that we will present a model of change and some methods of change that you can experience on the spot and also take with you. And those methods will help you continue to evolve and continue to make life better for yourself and become more complete.
Beautiful. In fact, we'll even do a snippet of that. And so, Teresa, before I close with our toast, or Erica, do we have any nuts and bolts that we need to make sure we touch on?
Do you want to announce kind of a couple of those upcoming things? We did the workshop, our next Midday Cafe. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so next Midday Cafe is, what is it, Teresa?
April. Sorry, I don't have the date.
18th. Yeah. Wednesday, April 18th. And so it'll be noon Eastern time. I'm posting a link in the chat right now. Just follow us on the Facebook page, Enneagram Great Lakes, so you can get registered for that great content. And we're excited to have Chris Hertz from the Sacred Enneagram with us that day. And so
wonderful.
One of our board members, Orion, is going to be interviewing him, so you won't want to miss that.
Yeah, so we're welcoming both Orion and Chris Hurwitz that day. Also, any of our upcoming events, if you are not on our newsletter, we want to make sure that we get you on the newsletter so that we can keep you updated with what's happening in the region. And so with that, let's all raise a glass. Are you ready? Here's to you, as good as you are. And here's to me, as bad as I am. But as good as you are, and as bad as I am, I'm as good as you are, as bad as I am. Salute, everybody. See you at Loyola.
See you at Loyola, hopefully.